Well, it's that time of the year, the end of 2021, so it's time to go over my personal top picks for the best looking and sounding movies on 4K Blu-ray this year. This list would also work for digital streaming and the Cloud Escape as well. What I did was take my scores per movie and average them out from the lowest to the highest. The list hasn't changed that much from the middle of the year, but I really wasn't expecting it to. Anyways, remember, this list is for both audio and video together as a whole, not just video alone or audio alone, and the audio has to be in Atmos or DTS:X since they are the newest surround formats. So your favorite movie from the 50s with a mono mix isn't gonna cut it. I know there's gonna be a bunch of comments focusing on just how good the video is on movies not on my list, but as a complete experience, it's gotta be video and audio together. This list also isn't gonna take into consideration how good or bad a movie is. So just because a movie might have bombed at the box office doesn't mean it can't look and sound great. If you don't care for audio and video, then this list is not gonna be for you. This, of course, is my subjective list, and yours will surely be different. With that being said, kicking off the list at number 10 is No Time to Die. It was shot on 35 and 65mm and IMAX. It's got a 4K DI with an aspect ratio of 239:1, so it's got black letterbox bars without the IMAX full screen ratio. Obviously, the best looking shots are going to be the ones shot in IMAX. They are 4K crispy with some very nuanced details. I do believe the opening of the movie as well as the Cuba portion was in IMAX. Everything else was shot in 35mm. And since the movie was shot on 35mm, there is a fine layer of grain throughout. Dolby Vision boosted the overall brightness with excellent natural color saturation with deep contrasting black levels. The Atmos mix I did feel was a bit hit and miss, but when it was hitting, the musical score was a knockout and had a big, epic Bond scale. The bass could have used a bit more bottom end, but all in all, the car chase at the beginning and the Cuba scene are the big standouts. At number 9 is Monster Hunter. We gave this a 9 for audio and a 9.2 for video. I wasn't expecting too much from this transfer, but it kind of blew me away by how it all turned out. It was shot in 4.5K and it's got a 4K DI, and the aspect ratio is 239:1. It's a Sony transfer, so the odds are it's gonna be 4K crispy. And indeed it is. There's no film grain to be seen at all since it was all shot digitally, so it's sharp and clean throughout. There's amazing detail whether it's a close-up or a CG creature, so you'll get tons of textures everywhere. Sometimes the resolution is so good it makes it easy to see how fake the props are. The HDR usage gives the movie a bright overall look, unlike some transfers where the HDR makes everything all dim. This makes a huge difference for all the scenes that takes place out in the desert because visually it looks hot and bright, and the HDR intensifies all the peak highlights. It also deepens blacks for the darker scenes underground and at night. The Atmos mix has possibly the most robust bass on the list. If we take a look at the Atmos viewer, you'll see that this is basically a static mix, so it won't have a bunch of objects dynamically moving through each speaker. It still has some awesome overhead usage during the action parts, and the amount of low frequency extension whenever Diablos makes an appearance should make your subwoofers work overtime. If you need a movie to showcase your home theater, Monster Hunter should already be in your collection. In at number 8 is Mortal Kombat. We gave this a 9.1 for video and a 9.3 for audio. It was shot in 4.5K with a 4K DI. Aspect ratio is 239:1 and the audio is in Dolby Atmos. It's got an actively dynamic mix with objects that freely move throughout all your different speakers. When Reptile moves through the room, you can hear him and see him actually move throughout the room. There's a nice bubble of surround during the quieter parts, and the soundtrack has some killer low frequency that'll vibrate your room. Video quality is detailed with an almost film-like appearance, so it isn't razor sharp, but close enough for the grain haters. HDR looked great with bright specular highlights such as Raiden's electricity, and HDR offered up some decent contrast as well. In at number 7 is Elysium. This is another Sony transfer, so you know you're going to be in for a treat. We gave this a 9 for audio and a 9.5 for video. It was shot in 3.3K and 1080p. It's got a 4K DI with an aspect ratio of 235:1, so it will have black letterbox bars. This movie came out in 2013, but you probably wouldn't think so by how sharp and clean this transfer is. There's tons of details from within the rundown inner city homes to the mechanical plant that Damon works at. The CG robots are so intricately rendered, you might think they were the real deal. The HDR amplifies the hot Los Angeles desert color palette, which gives this movie a very warm look. When things take place on Earth, specular highlights can get eye-squintingly bright from the LA sunlight to that crazy electric gun. The black levels were spot on and provided great contrast and layer separation. The audio is in Dolby Atmos and it's a very immersive one. Just like Monster Hunter, it's mostly a static mix with a couple of exceptions. When Damon blows up the robot in slow motion, you can track the gunshot till it hits the robots and things blow up. Whether it's a big action scene or a quiet one, there's always a nice sense of immersion from every channel. The bass during the explosions can reach ultra low, so be on standby for some impressive infrasonics. I wasn't expecting this movie to look this good or sound this good, but I'm glad to have it in the collection. And at number 6 is Zack Snyder's Justice League. We gave this a 9.5 for audio and a 9.4 for video. If you're going to sit through a 4-hour movie, it's a huge bonus that it looks and sounds this good. The movie was shot on 35mm with a 4K DI, and it's got an aspect ratio of 1.33. So you will have black bars on the sides of your display, unless you've got a 4x3 television you're still rocking, or if you're watching on an iPad. Now, unlike the first 2 Snyder DC movies, this Atmos mix on this is static throughout. It's still impressive sounding, but not quite as good as other movies. There's solid immersion from all the channels, especially from that opening when Superman screams that floats through all the speakers. And the action parts, of course, deliver with thunderous explosions. For me, the best part of the audio mix was the soundtrack. It's very different from the theatrical version and sounds amazing in Atmos. The video quality looks just as good as Snyder's other movies, film grain intact and all. I felt it wasn't as grainy as BVS or Man of Steel, but there's still enough present to bother the grain haters. It's got that filmic look about it since it was shot on film, and there's still a great amount of detail to be seen, and the HDR deepens black levels, which takes the dark gritty color palette to the next level. There's some shoddy CGI here and there, but as a whole, this is a visually impressive looking movie. It's like a graphic novel come to life, and a must own if you're a Snyder fan. Coming in at number 5 is Chaos Walking. This one got a 9.7 for audio and a 9.5 for video. It was shot in 6.5K with a 4K DI, and it's got an aspect ratio of 239:1. I feel I should have rated the video quality higher because this might be overjoyed by this transfer. The audio is in Dolby Atmos, and this mix excels with a very bass department. Now, if you need a movie to show off how sharp and detailed 4K can look, then you might want to give this movie a watch. It sounds pretty darn good too. In at number 4 is A Quiet Place Part 2. We gave this a 9.3 for video and a 9.9 for audio. It was shot on 35mm and in 4.5K, and it's got a 4K DI with an aspect ratio of 239:1. The audio mix is in Dolby Atmos, and this Atmos mix picks up right where the first one left off, meaning it's demo status. It's got the right mix of subtle ambiance and big action movie dynamics. It's a dynamically active mix with objects that move freely through all your speakers. You'll hear creatures crawling down from the high channels to the lower channels, and you'll be immersed in an atmospheric bubble. Bass response kicks hard during the action scenes, and the dialogue is always easy to hear. The image has that cinematic film-like quality, so you can expect a healthy dose of grain. It's got a high contrast look in certain parts due to its HDR, so explosions and flames jump right off the screen. Detail isn't the sharpest on the list, but it's a good step above the standard Blu-ray. CG creatures mesh nicely with the live action, and the heavily saturated color palette should look great on your display. If you're a fan of the first Quiet Place, then you'll want this movie to be in your collection as well. At number 3 is Godzilla vs. Kong. We gave this a 9.8 for audio and a 9.6 for video. It was shot in 6.5K and it's got a 4K DI. The aspect ratio is 239:1, so it does have black letterbox bars. Now this 4K transfer has got some crazy HDR going on. There's tons of bright vivid neon colors and some eye-blinding specular highlights. The CG creatures looked very good, if not a bit too cartoony if you were to compare it to the previous movies, but they're clean and very detailed nonetheless. Overall, it's not as crisp and sharp as Chaos Walking, but I think most of you guys would be impressed by the HDR usage. The audio is in Dolby Atmos, and it's an over-the-top action extravaganza. This has got a legit object-based mix with sound effects that move through all your different channels. The bass response digs crazy deep during the big monster fights, and the overhead channel activity sees a lot of action. The only negative thing that I had was that the dialogue could get drowned out when things got a little bit too loud. Otherwise, this is a straight demo-worthy mix and should be in your collection, if not just for the audio alone. In at number 2 is The Suicide Squad. We gave this a 9.7 for audio and a 9.8 for video. It was shot in 6K, 8K, and IMAX with a 4K DI. It's got a 1.90 aspect ratio, which almost fills the entire TV screen. It's got an Atmos mix that's a heavy hitter with some killer bass response. Starro, the giant starfish attacking the city, will have your subs working overtime and rumble your neighbor's walls. It's got a dynamically active Atmos mix in certain parts, so when the rats are surrounding King Shark, you'll hear those little guys come crawling out of every speaker that you've got. It's a fun soundtrack and will surround you in all directions. If you're someone that enjoys when IMAX movies are presented the way it was seen at the theater, then you'll like the way that this movie looks. It's nearly 4K crispy, so the details are very sharp right down to the costume textures and the starfish's CG skin. HDR makes colors pop with deep saturation, and you'll be squinting at all the peak highlights. And in at number 1, which to be honest maybe shouldn't be at number 1 since it's kind of been out for a few years, but they did make some changes this year and it's got a new remaster, which is Batman v Superman. We gave it a 10 for audio and a 9.6 for video. It was shot on 35mm with a 4K DI, and the aspect ratio is 239:1 and 1.43 for the newly included IMAX shots. The audio is in Dolby Atmos, and it'll make all your speakers work extra hard. The Doomsday Battle is straight up craziness with effects everywhere with some of the deepest bass response on the list. Just like Justice League, the musical score is a standout companion to all the sound traversing through every channel. The movie's got a huge cinematic soundstage and should give you a theatrical, immersive bubble from start to finish. The video quality is going to be the love or hate kind of thing for a lot of people. If you're a grain hater, you're going to despise this movie. If you're a grain lover, you're going to like the enhanced grain that this got over the older release. The IMAX shots are incredibly detail-rich with crispy 4K resolution, and the color palette got a nice boost in saturation and deeper black levels coming from the original release as well. This doesn't have any eye-candy HDR colors like Godzilla vs. Kong, but there's still some impressive peak highlights and luscious green kryptonite greens. Overall, it's a great visual improvement to the older 4K release, and the audio still rocks even after all these years. Once again, if you're a fan of the Snyderverse, then Batman v Superman is an absolute must-have. Now, I do have one honorable mention, which would really be on next year's list, but it has been available for a while now if you wanted to import it, although it doesn't officially release till January 11th, at least not here in the US. It's 2021's Dune. We gave it a 9.5 for video and a 9.7 for audio. It was shot in 4.5K and has a 4K DI. Aspect ratio is 239:1, and the audio is in Dolby Atmos. This has got a fantastic Atmos mix that's dynamically aggressive in the surround and high channels. It's got some impressively low end response, but does have some scenes with some hard to hear dialogue. The video quality doesn't have the IMAX scenes intact, but it's got a specific stylized look that some of you may or may not like. It's got a touch of softness to it with a light spattering of film grain, but retains a high level of detail whether it's a giant digital worm or a humongous spaceship. If you're not a fan of Blade Runner 2049, you may not like the way this movie looks, but if you did, I'm sure you'll be equally impressed with Dune. Plus, if you got a home theater setup, you'll definitely want to give this movie a listen. So that's my list for the best looking and sounding movies on 4K Blu-ray this year. Any one of these titles should put any good home theater setup to the test and should reveal just how dynamic your system is. Now, I haven't seen every single movie to come out this year, so I'm sure there's a few movies that are deserving to be on the list. But that is my subjective list, and what I found gave my home theater a serious workout. If you want to grab any of these titles, I'll leave some links for them down below in the video's description. So tell us what movies you'd put on your list for 2021. Leave a comment down below and let us know. As always, guys, thanks for watching. If you want, you can follow us on social media, and if you want to support the channel, get exclusive content, or great discounts on audio and video gear, then stop by our Patreon page. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you again next year.